Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this webinar co-organized by the OECD and LeadIT with the Stockholm Environment Institute. Today's topic will be the challenges and best practices in financing to accelerate decarbonisation. So we'll have 2.5 hours during the meeting. So Daniel Duma, who's a research fellow at LeadIT, will provide a scene setting. After that, Mathilde Ménard, Deputy Director from the Environment Directorate, will provide opening remarks. And following that, we'll have 2 sessions, one on the challenges and barriers to financing industry decarbonization, and a second session on the current and best practices in financing industry decarbonization. So I'm let the floor to Daniel Duma for the scene setting. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Is everything working? Great. Then maybe we can also put on the slides. But until then, hi everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to set the scene for what I believe will be a very interesting discussion. My name is Daniel Duma. I'm a research fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute, and I am in charge with developing a program called Finance for Sustainable Development. So, which matches very well with this subject. And my scene setting today will be mostly based on a short paper we've recently published together with my colleague Aaron Maltese. And this paper, sadly, contributes with questions, with key questions. I know that the last thing we need right now when we're desperate for answers is more questions, but we believe these questions help us put some order into the thinking about financing industrial decarbonization, and also help us answer the key question: is finance really an issue with industrial decarbonization? And we'll get there. And just a word of caution. So when we say industrial decarbonization, we tend to group together the usual sectors: steel, cement, chemicals. We are very much aware they are very different, but they have one thing in common: their green alternative, let's say their green option, is not operational anywhere in the world, and which is why these questions apply to them, I would say, equally. Right. So the imperative is for reducing emissions. We know these emissions from hard-to-abate sectors represent a significant share of total greenhouse gas emissions, and we also know that with developing countries actually developing, we will see a shift in the pattern of consumption. So the key question is, okay, what do we do? Where do we start? What does it take to reduce emissions? Like a very basic question. So we can either increase the efficiency of existing processes, so invest in equipment that increases efficiency. We can either do investments or policy interventions that increase circularity, the rate of recycling, for example. Or we can move to green primary production. And here we're talking about the breakthrough technologies of hydrogen-based steel making or cement with carbon capture. And from this very basic categorization, we already see a potential trade-off. Increasing in the efficiency of existing processes may mean purchasing equipment with long useful lives. So it's not unreasonable for some actors to consider whether such an investment would lead to lock-in effects, and whether other players may be waiting to move straight to green primary production. So from this very simple categorization, we arrive at our first set of questions. Next slide, please. So to what extent are investments in efficiency leading to lock-in effects? How much priority should be given to short-term emission reductions from increased efficiency in existing plants, and especially in developing countries? And does that differ? Does the answer to this question differ in developing regions compared to, I don't know, some of the OECD countries? So these would be our first set of questions. Moving then to the business case. Next slide, please. For the three types that we discussed, let's take efficiency. If we have a credible answer to the first set of questions, what does it take to what's the business case of investing in increasing efficiency? Well, they should be viable on their own, especially in a high energy price, high commodity price scenario, and where they are, let's say they are value creative and they're not happening, especially in some developing countries. Probably blended finance would be the most suitable. A combination of technical assistance with some risk mitigation should do the trick. On circularity improvements, this is already, like, recycling is already a significant business in steel and some other sectors. So we don't see finance to be a significant bottleneck to that. While for other sectors like plastics, probably policy is needed first before we even get to the point of finance becoming an issue. Where things get complicated is with the breakthrough technologies. These are not at the commercial stage. And most projections show that even when we get there, they will suffer from a significant cost disadvantage. The production cost would be higher by, I don't know, from anything from 30% to 100%, depending on the sector and the type of calculation. So here we're really talking about demonstration finance and demonstration not only of the technology but of the business model as well. And we think that specifically for breakthrough technologies, it would be a good illustration to compare it with another sector that suffered from a massive cost disadvantage and that was pretty slow to scale, but that has become a conventional investment nowadays. And we're talking about utility scale renewables. Next slide, please. So there are some similarities, but also a number of significant differences. And we're going to talk about mostly about the differences and what we see as some potential solutions to explore. So with renewable energy, this innovation, let's call it, the power purchase agreement with take or pay clauses basically secures the revenue side. The risk then is mostly based on the creditworthiness of the off-taker and on policy. And these can be covered through guarantees or political risk insurance, and as it's being done in many emerging markets as we speak. The situation is not similar in industrial decarbonization. There we have many more players, right? More buyers and sellers. We have sometimes global competitive markets. So the risk goes beyond a single country or counterparties. This already makes things more challenging. But we think there are ways around it. So there are solutions to explore, which will obviously involve a lot of coordination, but commitments from corporate climate leaders, public procurement to create that critical demand. And obviously carbon pricing would go a long way in helping these demonstration phases scale. Then, as an investment profile, renewable energy is very much suitable for a certain kind of investor, looking for low returns, low risk, certain long-term investors. So you see them active in renewable energy in many markets. While industry is riskier even without decarbonization. So adding to a risky, relatively risky sector, an unproven technology, probably means the risks are reasonably too high for conventional finance now. So this is where governments and DFIs have to take a leading role, and then have, let's say, investors seeking exposure to low carbon assets follow. And finally, with renewable energy, we're talking about a mature technology, declining costs. We have a technology that's competitive with fossil options in many jurisdictions. While with industrial decarbonization, as I said, we're talking about a relatively unproven technology with known higher production costs. So in a way, like renewable energy, there will be a combination, revenue support, cost reductions through learning, and increasing the cost of alternatives through carbon pricing. As we'll see, this is probably unavoidable. Next slide, please. So here we are at the second set of questions. How do we create stronger offtake signals for green industrial products in developing regions? And how can we get the risk profile of an investment like that low enough to even consider conventional risk mitigation instruments? Because now they would probably not be effective. And also, finally, what sources of capital would be willing to take the risk for these first of kind low emissions production facilities in developing countries? Finally, moving towards our third set of questions. Next slide, please. We, let's say, fortunately have the interesting case of Sweden, which just happens to be the place where we're based. As we know, Sweden hosts a number of advanced green hydrogen-based steel pilots, and as we understand, they are close to reaching agreements on financing an expansion to commercial scale. So they're not there yet, but allegedly they are close. So we thought it's useful to see exactly what made them possible. They didn't happen only because of they didn't happen independently, let's say. Next slide, please. So what made them possible was a combination of policy and support at project level. On the policy side, a credible net zero target, 2045 in the case of Sweden, obviously helped. Then a process that helped significantly was the road mapping fossil-free Sweden, which helped with planning how that decarbonization is going to be, let's say, implemented. Then another driver that's hugely significant for everything that has to do with hydrogen, right, is the expectation. Let's see if the expectation becomes reality of abundant, cheap, clean power in the north of Sweden. And also, as a member of the EU, the perspective of ending free allocation of certificates under the emission trading system and the gradual phasing of the carbon border adjustment mechanism also meant that there is protection long term against against higher emission competition, lower cost, higher emission competition. At the project level, the project did benefit from government and EU grants for feasibility studies and for research and development. Also, there was a loan guarantee program through for industry investments with a climate impact. On the demand side, the commitments of certain players of net zero by a certain target 2040, 2045 only meant that those players would have to source their inputs from low carbon options sooner or later, and in a way similar to the, let's say, case of renewable energy, there have been offtake agreements with certain vehicle makers that secured some of the demand side. They're not huge, of course, but for this demonstration stage and for stepping into the closer to the commercial stage, they might be highly significant. So finally, we arrive at our third set of questions. Next slide, please. So looking at the case of Sweden, how can similar enabling conditions for industry transition be stimulated and recreated and adapted, obviously, in developing regions? What are the realistic first steps? Okay, where do we start? There were many components to those enabling measures. Where do we start? And what the hardest gaps to overcome? And finally, what is the role of climate finance in providing support for first movers? How do you move past competition implications? How do you pick the first projects that will happen? And what exactly would be the modality of making that support operational? These were the questions what we call key questions. We are very happy to explore some of the answers and to add to the questions. And I'm absolutely sure some of these questions will be addressed in this webinar. And I'm really looking forward to hearing them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for the scene setting. Thanks especially for highlighting the different types of investments related to industry decarbonization with their specific characteristics and challenges. And as you mentioned, we aim to discuss today what kind of conditions are required to create an enabling environment for investments, but also discuss the role that climate and blended finance can play in order to foster the financing. So I now hand over to Mathilde Menard, Deputy Director of the OECD Environment Directorate, to provide some opening remarks.
Thank you, and thank you, Daniel, for this very good, excellent setting. So what I will say is kind of maybe summing up some of what you have said in less words. So let's put it this way. Transition of the energy system is expanding to cover all the sectors from power generation to end-use sectors such as industry, transports, buildings, all their infrastructures. And we are seeing a number of countries, regions, cities that are setting net zero targets in law or in policy documents, or that have announced pledges and objectives. And today, I mean, something good news, the global net zero coverage amounts to 88% of emissions and 92% of the world GDP. So it looks good. And in addition, nearly like 1,000 companies have pledged to reach net zero emissions by this mid-century, often embedding this objective in their corporate strategies or transition plans. So all that looks good, but the investments to decarbonize the industry sector are not taking place at the scale nor at the pace needed to achieve net zero targets. And if we look at the numbers between 2016 and 2020, the global annual average investment for decarbonizing the manufacturing industry sector amounted to around 160 million billions, sorry, US dollars. So it's by year. And by 2050, the investments need to increase by a factor of 3 to reach really the 0.5 trillion per year that is needed for production assets only. And once again, this number could be multiplied by a factor of 3 to 5 when accounting for required investment across the value chain, notably for electricity and fuel generation and related infrastructures. So we see progress, but we are far from where we need to be, if we really want to achieve a net zero, not too long, in not too long time. So far, the investments supporting industry decarbonization have mainly focused on the low-hanging fruits, such as electrification of processes and some energy efficiency technologies, as was really clear in Daniel's presentation. But in addition to further efforts in the conventional technologies, because we need further efforts there, it's key to scale up investment in breakthrough technologies, including low carbon hydrogen and also carbon capture, use and storage. And this is especially important in the hard to abate subsectors such as cement, steel and chemicals. Yet these technologies are often very capital intensive and they generate additional production costs. Thus, they are hampering the competitiveness of the first movers. So it was very clear also in Daniel's presentation that there is a key difficulty here. And the financial ecosystem has made progress in embracing the climate change challenges, notably by developing all these taxonomies, sustainable finance taxonomies, using ESG criteria to drive investment decision, and also like improving the disclosure of information on portfolios, on the portfolio's climate exposure. But, however, there are still gaps to really understand and assess the alignment of these portfolios trajectories with the Paris Agreement. And in turn, also to ensure that these net zero commitments are really turned into action. They have a real impact on the ground, I would say. So in September last year, the OECD Clean Energy Finance and Investment Mobilization Program, which is part of our Environment Directorate at the OECD, launched a framework for industry's net zero transition. And this framework is currently implemented in Egypt, in Indonesia, South Africa, and in Thailand. And the implementation of the framework will provide solutions for improving enabling conditions and for financing the decarbonization of several industry subsectors, such as iron, steel, or textile. And these solutions will be designed based on the barriers that must be overcome and matched with a list of implementable projects. The framework implementation will also bring together the policymakers, the industry actors, the financial institutions to analyze how a range of economic and financial instruments and approaches covering both the public and the private finance can help to improve the economic viability of decarbonization projects in the industry. The framework will also pay particular attention, of course, to blended finance solutions by assessing how public finance instruments can help mobilize private finance, because that's key here. And the framework will contribute thus to filling the financing gap for industry decarbonization. And in this context, this webinar today, co-organized with the leadership group for industry transition of the Stockholm Environmental Institute, this seminar aims at doing two things. First, to understand better the challenges and the barriers to financing industry decarbonization. And second, to highlight emerging and best practices used to finance industry decarbonization projects and how they can be implemented. So this is the third webinar in an OECD series on industry decarbonization and low carbon hydrogen, which is taking place throughout the year under this CEFIM program. I believe that this dialogue will reflect on actions that can help governments and financial institutions upscale investment, because that's what we need. We need to upscale investment for industry decarbonization. And we are very grateful to have distinguished speakers from governments, from the private sector, of course, from financial institutions and international organizations. And we have a lot of participants also that we hope we contribute to the exchange of experience. In each session of this webinar, after initial presentations by panelists, we will encourage the audience to really ask questions through the chat or simply by raising their hands or turning their camera on. And for your information, we will post on our website the recording of this event, of the presentations also, and some summary notes about the discussions that will happen. With this, I will now hand over to Assa Moberg from the Stockholm Environment Institute. Assa, you will moderate the session 1, and this session will focus on the challenges and barriers for financing industry decarbonization. And so I will leave you there and wish you a very interesting discussion and exchange of experience. Assa, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I am Assa Moberg, and I'm with the LeadIT Secretariat. I'm happy to moderate this session with these excellent speakers providing different perspectives on the topic. So it's Astika Andini, who's the Industrial Quality Management Assessor at the Green Industry Center in Indonesia, and Tarek M. Tarai, who's the Director of Department of Energy at UNIDO, Daniel Morris, Senior Climate Change Specialist at the Climate Investment Funds at the World Bank, and also Cécile Seguinot, who's Steel Decarbonization Analyst at OECD. But without further ado, I will give the word now to Astika Andini for her presentation. Please. Astika. We cannot hear you, Astika. You might be muted.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear my son?
Yes, now we can hear you. Please.
All speaker and all participants of this meeting, what that we respect. Thank you very much, and good evening. Please be open to everyone.
There seems to be some problem with the sound.
My name is Astika. I'm representing the Center of Green Industry to presenting about green industry policy in support of net zero emission achievement. As we know, the climate change is a major threat of global property and development. Now, President Jokowi in G20 meeting have a commitment with handling climate change. That his statement, we need to ensure that the transition of new and renewable energy is carried out in line with the principle of energy security, stability, and affordability. in Indonesia, government has a commitment with a sustainable development goal and a national determined contribution NDC. We target for reduce greenhouse gas emission. Our emission first in target 29%, and we upgrade the target in with enhanced NDC in 31.89%. And then we have a target for the net zero emission in 2060. Our strategy in Ministry of Industry, we have a green industry strategy to achieve decarbonization. Why it is important in manufacturing sector, because we know that now market demand for green industry continue to increase, and such as green product procurement, and consumer awareness. And then export destination country regulation that requires sustainable practice such carbon tax, eco label, or carbon border adjustment mechanism that in Europe region. And then we have a contribution to country commitment on international conventions such as Paris Agreement, Stockholm Convention, etc. The important that there is a vulnerability to climate and disaster that disrupt the supply of industrial raw material. This is because as we know, natural resources exploration and exploitation can negative impact to biodiversity and water conservation, and impact the climate vulnerability, and it make crop failure and food resilience. That's why we need a green industry to every industry to maintain their material, water, energy efficiency, and the low carbon technology use, and then waste management, and implement circular economy. We know that in industrial cost, in total production cost in energy bill of heavy industry share 90 until 20% of the total production cost, and then material bill can share 9 until 66% of the total production cost. The cost for environmental process give 2 until 8% from the total production cost. The implementation of green industry can make interest cost saving, reduce cost of production, and then increase green product sales, and increase sustainable investment and capital gain, and revenue from the carbon trade. That make our utilization become maximum, and increase productivity and product competitiveness, and give tax or devisa, and still have environmental conservation, sustainability, and people health. This is our program that we has been implementing to acceleration and tracking progress for greenhouse gas emission reduction in industrial sector to achieve decarbonization. First, we have a setting and baseline to calculate the mitigation project for NDC target, and then we publish guidance and guideline related to inventory, MRV, and mitigation action for the industry. Third, we develop online greenhouse gas reporting platform for industry, integrate with CINAS, National Industrial Information System, and fourth, we conduct data verification regularly for 1 year periodic in-house training, expert assignment, and other facilitation for the industry. And last, we established Green Industry Standard and Green Industry Award for Green Industry Award for industry that best achievement. For the sustainability manufacturing practice like ESG, we have a Green Industry Standard requirement is arranged about how the limit material efficiency, energy efficiency, water efficiency, and production process, and product waste management, and factory management. We have 34 screen industry standard. It is comply with corporate ESG requirement. For government key initiative and project, what still done, and to the next, we have a Green Industry Standard and Certification, Green Industry Award, Green Small Medium Enterprise, and Green Industrial Park. And we had in next year, we develop for the carbon footprint and green supply chains and green public procurement in government procurement, and retrofit and low carbon technology like refuse derivative fuel in cement industry, waste heat recovery in cement industry, carbon capture storage, some industry like pulp and paper, and fertilizer, cement, and then another technologies. This is greenhouse gas emission reduction investment estimation for the industrial sector. We have research about this the investment for the industrial sector need for the low carbon technology transition. In cement industry, we have this research collaborate with UNDP actually. For the cement example, for the cement industry, we need 16.8 US dollar per ton CO2 equivalent. average abandonment cost. The industry need for the financing, restructuring and revitalization of the green industry in production and utility equipment, assistance and funding in the construction of physical infrastructure for industrial enterprise or eco-industrial park, easy of market access and financing of financial service, as well as the application of green taxonomy. We have Indonesian green taxonomy for the restructuring and revitalization. We have from the government budget. I hope next private sector can join for the restructuring and revitalization for the green industry in production and utility equipment. Challenge and support need in industrial decarbonization in industry. LeadIT assume that the industrial sector is only responsible in greenhouse gas mitigation for category only IPPU, which is the manufacturing industry contribute to 3 greenhouse gas mitigation sector, namely in not only in IPPU, but contribute in energy and waste sector. This has an impact on the APBN or government budget allocation and access to national and international climate change funding. Second, funding support is needed in the industrial restructuring program with low carbon machinery and technology. The Ministry of Industry will prepare a technology audit and energy audit to prepare technology recommendation as a part of the manufacturing sector greenhouse gas mitigation. Third, the Indonesian government will encourage green public procurement where product has been certified according to the green industry standard. We receive priority in the government procurement. Last, in an effort to provide certainty for investment and the carbonization development, green finance rules are needed that regulate the relationship between creditors and debtors and make it easier for the business actor to access financing in the form of soft loan, low interest and long tenor. But it is too risky for the financial institution. Area of investment and collaboration. We have next renewable energy such as solar energy and bioenergy, like solar PV and its component and or biofuel, low carbon technology, cogeneration and HV combination heat and power, waste heat recovery, waste to energy and carbon capture storage, etc. Innovation in green material and product such as green textile, green packaging, nonetheless electrical vehicle, charging station, battery manufacturing, any type of EV and manufacturing is complete. Thank you. Maybe this is my presentation. I hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Astika, for a very, very, very rich presentation. And I think we will come back with questions and also dig into the challenges you see in processing all these activities that you have mentioned here. But I think we go for the next presentation and get into the discussion after the presentations. So then I would like to invite Tarek M. Taira, who's the Director of the Department of Energy at UNIDO, for his presentation. Please.
Thank you very much, Elsa, and really a pleasure to be here with you. And thanks to the OECD and LeadIT for the organizing this timely webinar. I think I was actually not going to spend time on this presentation because a lot of what I wanted to say, actually, Daniel in his scene setting really captured the key questions and the key issues that are to be discussed in terms of industry transition. I'm particularly from the perspective of UNIDO, the UN Industrial Development Agencies. Perhaps the question is asked, why are we engaged in this space? What is the role of a UN agency, and why are we're getting involved in this? And I think, let me just spend 1 minute on this from the perspective, I think, and I think because of the question Daniel raised, I have the sort of, it makes it clear that really getting industry and the incentive regime for industry to change behavior toward net zero pathways, it's a daunting challenge for country by country process. And I think creating a global policy framework for countries to collaborate and push the envelope in terms of technology, R&D, the breakthrough technologies, but also creating markets for lead markets for these products requires some sort of coordination. I think several ideas were mentioned around the need to create clarity in terms of the standards that is required for low carbon products, steel, cement, etc. So that's where we are active as a UN agency. But I actually want to jump into two challenges that sort of embedded in some of the questions that Daniel raised. And I want to take also the perspective of developing economies, because that is the context in which we will see the growth in demand for industrial commodities, being steel, cement, fertilizers, aluminum, chemicals, and the production as well. So we will see that. So I want to focus on two dimensions of this. I've listed several there, but I wanted to focus on the political economy context of emerging economies, which without really tackling some of these variables in the political economy that drive the decision-making at the policy-making level to push the envelope to create incentives for industry changing behavior, we will not see the scale of investment that we aspire to see, despite all the rhetorics about the importance of this for the climate agenda. So one is that if you're looking at the case in Sweden that Daniel referred to and the conditions that created the conditions, we don't see these present in developing countries. I mean, the trigger, part of the trigger that Daniel mentioned was the sort of the phasing out of the ETC free allowances and sort of created a momentum. In developing economies, we don't see yet a movement to price carbon, particularly on industrial commodities. The perspective of policymakers often is that they are, on the one hand, governments don't have the fiscal power to invest in the kind of R&D demonstration and in the kind of subsidies that we see in Europe and in the US. That is not, we don't see it. And I think so the flow, the ability of governments to play a role using its fiscal power is not there. The second dimension is, of course, sensitivity of political regimes to price sensitivity to these commodities. I mean, I think any increase in the price of steel, cement, fertilizer is a death sentence for some of the politicians, particularly in non-democratic regimes. I mean, this is just to put a political economic context on the. So I think we have to be sensitive to that dynamics and see how we sensitize and opportunities for industry in developing and emerging markets to see the space and the market opportunity to invest in decarbonization. And I think the export market might be one of these areas where we can see clearly some countries are interested, like Saudi Arabia is investing in green ammonia with the view that it's exported, putting the whole infrastructure around sort of hydrogen-based ammonia production. Some countries like Egypt might be tempted to experiment also with green steel or green cement. Green steel, particularly cement, is of course local production, local consumption, most of the cases, except in the eastern, the Balkan region, where there's incentive now to start thinking about the issues in the context of accessing the European market and the implication of the CBAM on cement manufacturers in the Balkan countries. So there's a bit of dynamics there has to be. So that goes back to the question that Daniel raised. So what type of finance and what type of finance we need today, and what the role of climate finance in the space. I think there is a lot of need right now to invest in what I call sensitization. Policy sensitization, market sensitization, particularly in the context of developing countries. These are small investments, not the scale that we were talking about in technology, but this is actually an area where we still need a lot of funding, what I call advocacy money, to create a change of perceptions. That is, on the one hand, an issue to tackle the political economy context and helping governments build an emission trading scheme, carbon accounting regime, all the soft measures around the enabling environment, and most importantly, creating a sense in political discussion and economic discussion of developing and emerging, where the alignment between industrial transition, industrial decarbonization, and strategic economic priorities of the country. That has to be quite embedded, because we don't see it yet strongly embedded in some of this. So that's one set of discussion. We can sort of dig deeper into this. The second area I wanted to talk about is more the technology context. The technology context is that the breakthrough technology we talked about require certain type of investment infrastructure that we don't see it happening, and it would be erroneous to put that investment on the what I call the manufacturing firms, the OMEs, the original manufacturing enterprises, like the steel producer or the cement producer, because you're talking about an infrastructure around carbon capture and storage. It's slightly different. You need investment in transport infrastructure, in carbon capture infrastructure, in technology, in storage infrastructure. Similarly, in the hydrogen. So the approach here is that so there's so many elements in the value chain that makes the decision to invest, and the perception of technology risk is higher than if you would do just a simple heat recovery retrofit in a cement plant. That's not the case. So it's slightly more complicated from a technology perspective. And this is an invitation to start thinking of a different business model around the delivery of decarbonization services. Could we think in terms of cluster approach to carbon capture and storage that you involve the cement, fertilizer? So industrial scale, industrial state approach. I think Astika in her presentation referred to some of that thinking and some of the policy initiatives. There's a bit of discussion on this in some of the emerging markets where you could think of a hub or a cluster approach. And so that changes the dynamic of who's financing what and who's financing and where are the distribution of risk and so that we still, so you cannot expect today a cement factory, let's say in India, to go and retrofit a CCUS plant when the framework under CCUS is not politically agreed, when mapping of storage facilities is not understood, so all that infrastructure element is there. So that is also another area where green climate finance could help look into the infrastructure element around these breakthrough technologies, support countries on road mapping and assessing and addressing some of these. So these are risk areas to be addressed. Eventually, at the end of the day, it's all about demand. So you have to create the demand and deepen the demand. And I don't want to take too much time now, but I maybe in the second round of interventions, maybe we can jump into how do we really deepen the issue of offtake or stronger offtake signals, as Daniel put it. So I'll stop here and pass it back to you, Oscar.
Yes, thank you so much, Tarek, for diving into this, and for sure we'll come back to this in the discussions later on. And now it's a good connect then with the CEF and the possibilities for investments. So Daniel Morris, who's a senior climate change specialist at CEF, please go ahead.
Thank you, Osa. Real pleasure to be here with you today and the panel. Great discussion so far. And I think we're happy to be here. I'm happy to be here on behalf of the Climate Investment Funds because we are hoping to provide solutions to some of the questions that you all are posing through our new industry decarbonization program. I think it's also really useful to have this conversation. We in CEF, and I'll get into who we are for those who may not know in just a moment, but we've been involved in this space for a couple of years now. And what we've noticed is that the focus has very much been on sort of the OECD world, which is what's going on in sort of the US and Europe in terms of technological advances, in terms of different efforts to decarbonize hard to abate industries. And we felt that the focus on developing countries has really been lacking. And so we're happy that this group can come together and have this conversation because we think it's really important at this time when there's so much interest in the space and so much momentum to try and make things happen. So for those who don't know, the Climate Investment Funds, we are what's called a financial intermediary fund. We are housed at the World Bank, but we don't represent the World Bank. We actually sort of represent a collaboration between 6 multilateral development banks. So the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, and the 4 major regional development banks, with an effort to bring concessional finance to bear in particularly challenging areas where we can harness the expertise and the knowledge of MDBs. We can work with country governments and hopefully private sector to sort of hone in on what their priorities are and really make targeted investments that can lead to transformational change, creation of markets, a number of things. So we have been building this industry decarbonization program for a couple years now, to really address some of the issues that have been brought up today. And I very much appreciate the scene setting that Daniel provided and his presentation and sort of setting out those 3 areas, potential areas of investment, right? Sort of efficiency improvements, circularity improvements, and breakthrough technologies. Our model is really meant to be able to address all of those things. And I think the question for us that we would look to groups like this to help us understand is where can those investments, where are they necessary, right? And what's the balance of approaching all 3 of those? You know, the demand for this, I think from our view, is definitely growing in these emerging markets. And there are some market signals there. I recall an IEA study of 110 companies in steel, construction material, and chemicals that said companies with declining emissions intensity saw rising returns on their invested capital and experienced a somewhat lower cost of capital. So there are signals there, but as previous speakers have said, that's not quite enough, right? And the point of this panel is to figure out what the barriers are. I think our view in CEF and how we're approaching it through our program is that there are familiar challenges, at least for us, right? We're talking about market uncertainty. We're talking about regulatory uncertainty, political risk, technology risk. All those things have been mentioned in the conversation so far today. Well, CEF was established in 2008. Actually, I think today might be our 15th birthday. We've been around for a decade and a half, focusing on these challenges specifically, right? Providing concessional finance to be paired with MDB finance, private finance, government finance to take on first mover risks, test new business and investment models. mobilize our partners, open up markets, and catalyze transformational change. We have over 400 projects in 70 different countries, the vast majority of which is focused on clean energy and clean technology, which you think, as you know, Daniel highlighted, there are similarities with this space, some important differences, but similarities as well. So, you know, we focus on blended finance, and that was identified as one tool, maybe not the end-all be-all tool, but I think it's a good start, and it does need to be paired with public investments and public commitments. You know, when you talk about sort of the blended finance space, the term de-risking comes up a lot. How do you mix public and private and things like that? What my view is, having been here for a little while, is that it's not just about the public sector making areas safe for private sector investment. It really is about grading the road to the outcomes that we want to see. Public sector finance really paves the path to decarbonization, sets it for private sector to follow, whether they want to or not, right? And I think at the end of the day, we are kind of talking about an area where you will have first movers that are willing to take risks, that are willing to be out there, and some other actors that they have their business models, those business models work, and they're not interested in changing them. So, you know, that's sort of a long-term issue. I think short-term, the question for us here is, where are the challenges that we face now? How do we get started? How do we start moving things forward? That's where we really hope to come in with our blended concessional finance model, bringing different types of things to bear in the space. So I'll just kind of talk a little bit about how we are planning to approach things, and where the questions that we want to be answered can really be highlighted by this group. Our model is one where we sort of establish where we're going to work thematically. So for this industry decarbonization program, we're working on industrial decarbonization. And typically what we've done in the past is go out and solicit countries to come forward. What are you interested in doing? Identify areas where they think they have a comparative advantage to invest. They have interest. They maybe have some policy changes in train that can help benefit development of markets, or you know, just achieving their climate goals. We take
Daniel,
those. Yeah.
Just if you want to wrap up a little bit, so we have the time for the discussion with the group as well. Sorry about that.
Yeah, let me finish the model, and then I'm happy to turn it over to others. So we basically ask countries to put together investment plans that will allow them to sort of set the path of how they want to invest over time, bringing in the private sector, bringing in other actors. And that model has worked really well, but I think the challenge for us in this space is really marrying that government-focused model with the need to bring private sector in and identify the specific areas and specific challenges that they face. So we've taken, over the past couple of months, consultation process, bringing different stakeholders together to identify how we can graft our model into the different areas of decarbonization in industry, and how we can focus on both sort of efficiency improvements and breakthrough technologies, marrying government efforts with the private sector to make sort of the most targeted investments our concessional finance can make, that will then sort of increase the ability of others to come in, create markets, and move the path forward. So I'll stop there and just say, looking forward to questions from the audience. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Great. And to wrap up this session before the discussion, I would like to give the word to Cécile Séguineau, who's at the Steel Unit at OECD. Please, Cécile.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so thank you, and good afternoon to all of you. Thank you very much for the invitation. So indeed, I will go through some of the questions that were raised in the scene setting, but with a focus on an illustration from the iron and steel sector, as you mentioned, as we indeed in our team serve the OECD Steel Committee. So let me start by highlighting the gap between decarbonization, ambition, and implementation, and which is particularly striking for the iron and steel sector, where we have indeed on the one hand almost all crude steel production, which is located in countries that have announced a net zero target for their whole economy. But when we look at the level of the steel companies, so steel companies which are the implementer of decarbonization ultimately, the share decreases to 30%. And if we go one step further and look at what is the actual primary steel production, which is compatible with the net zero pathway, it is less than 1%. So this gap is indicative of the decarbonization challenges for the sector, and is underpinned by a lack of viable business cases for net zero line project, as shown by this illustration, and indeed indicating strongly negative NPV for various projects and countries. So lack of viable business cases, which result from multiple challenges. We've already discussed this, so I will skip this part. But also with the highlight that in addition to the challenges, there are other barriers specifically for emerging and developing economies to attract financing for industry decarbonization. So we already seen this, some of these aspects in previous presentations, so I skip also. And then in terms of enabling conditions, so we have different types of enabling conditions that have also been mentioned previously. So I will rather focus on some examples, some existing or announced measures which actually are acting as enabling condition for decarbonizing the steel sector, so related to the enabling condition. So first, if we look at in terms of technologies and the need to scale up technologies, so mainly we're talking about hydrogen and CCUS for the iron and steel sector, we have seen a growing number of projects that have been announced worldwide, a number of projects which has more than doubled over the past 2 years, so interesting progress on that front. And on investment and financing instrument, when we look at this industrial project pipeline implying this breakthrough technology, what we see so far is that many of these projects involve government support with cash grants. We see also there are two examples of instruments that are worth to be mentioning. So we have one example with indeed one Swedish company, H2 Green Steel, a new entrant announcing the financing of its 5 billion euros flagship project through equity and debt financing, and having secured 3.5 billion debt financing last year. And in India, a major steel producer, so the GSW, which has raised a sustainability-linked bond of $500 million, and which includes sustainable performance target based on carbon intensity of steel production. Then in terms of de-risking mechanism, so recently we did one example with Germany having announced carbon contract for difference program and covering the steel sector. I mentioned here other example of tax credit, for example, in the US, which indeed do not directly relate to steel production, but indirectly through hydrogen or CCUS, because as we also mentioned, in the end, any measure or policy aiming to foster hydrogen or CCUS deployment also contributes to increase the confidence to invest in steel projects based on these technologies. And when it comes to competitiveness and increasing the level playing field, we have emission content criteria for traded products that are emerging, such as, of course, the CBAM in the EU and the global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminium that has been announced between the US and the EU. And finally, maybe the most advanced and most active area among these different types of enabling condition for steel, which relate to market for green steel products with, for instance, multiple purchase commitments agreement between steel producer and end user, so car manufacturer or domestic appliance, but also green public procurement with the same IDDI initiative, include also corporate barrier coalitions, and multiple initiatives so far for definition and standards for low emission steel production, in which include also some initiatives related to finance. So beyond this enabling condition, and also to echo to the question of investment raised in the setting scene, the critical aspect also lies in increasing capital flow for industry decarbonization, but also channeling the investment toward net zero line project. And these stakes also apply to the steel sector, when we have, on the one hand, massive investment required for the sector, with estimates around $1.5 trillion of cumulative investment in the next 30 years. And on the other hand, the need to also direct investments towards technology choices that are compatible with the net zero pathway. And this is currently not the case when we look at the commercial project plan or underway in the coming years. For the steel sector, we have more than half of the planned steel capacity, which relate to the highest emission intensive production methods. So there is a need of both increasing capital flow and orienting this flow to 1.5 degree aligned projects. So this is about the future asset, but what about also the existing assets? So we have indeed 2/3 of the existing assets in steel, which relate to high emission intensive production methods, so the coal-based production method, which are not compatible as such with the net zero pathway, because not equipped with CCUS also. So with a strong risk of emission lock-in and stranded assets. And this risk is even more pronounced in emerging and developing economies, in Asia in particular, because the existing assets are on average younger and more emission intensive. And some of these countries also experience strong steel capacity growth and concentrate the majority of emission intensive projects that are underway. And actually, this picture highlights the fact that the transition finance will be absolutely crucial to support the long-term transformation for such assets, assets which are today not compatible with the net zero pathway. And so this question of existing asset is crucial in sectors such as steel, with capital intensive and long-lived assets. So it's not just about new plants, but how to manage also the transformation of existing ones. And so I will conclude referring to the last question mentioned in the concept note, also on the public and private finance institution, and how on which aspect they could join forces to support industry decarbonisation financing. So first aspect would be, for instance, by sharing common goals, ensuring policy alignment toward net zero, including, for instance, standardized framework for reporting or criteria for labeling and classifying financial instruments. Second, cooperation to increase transparency, accountability, for instance, encouraging data disclosure, best practices for MRV. And finally, cooperation, of course, to mobilize various sources of financing, new forms of financing approaches, as we've heard before, and which could be complementary by notably leveraging, for instance, public finance to de-risk projects to attract private investment, stimulate local capital market. But I guess that this will discuss more in depth in the next session. So I stop here and thank you very much for your attention. Looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Yes, thank you all so much. As there are so much interesting to tell in this area, there is unfortunately not so much room for the Q&A, but we will do our best with the minutes we have. I think maybe we can also then look a little bit back to the introduction made by Daniel, and we can have maybe hear your views on how much priority should be given to this maybe more easy to get increased efficiency of existing processes, and or rather to focus on breakthrough for finance and the challenges of possibility of leading to lock-in effects. I don't know, Astika, if you want to have a go on that. Do you have any thoughts on that, where finance should preferably be focused? Or Cecile, if you want to have a go.
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Sorry, I was thinking about this division of different type of investments that Daniel also produced on efficiency, circularity, or breakthrough. And if you have any opinions on the difference there, where to focus, and the challenges of lock-in if going for the more short-term emissions reductions.
Yes, okay. Yeah, indeed. So if I take from the insight that we have from the iron and steel sector, I would say that we talk about the recycling. So recycling indeed is not just only about a finance aspect. You also need for steel to have access to scrap to recycle. So, but indeed, where in region where scrap is available, I mean, recycling is a mature technology. So I would say that the biggest challenges when it comes to iron and steel would rather focus on the breakthrough technology. And also when we think because energy efficiency, yes, is the first step, of course, but when we look at the biggest picture on what could be the maximal emission reduction potential, it's a first step, but it's not sufficient to reach near zero emission still. So what we see when we look at the project pipeline that are currently operating is that some plants are really focusing on adapting their process or transforming their assets. So it's not necessarily new plants, and it can be a first step approaches, but of course it will depend. And then I insist it will depend not only at the country level, but really at the plant level, because depending on the characteristic of the plant, also the financial aspect, the project it may be the best choices or not. So, but I think that what is important is when we think about new assets, to think about how we could in the future adapt to a net zero pathway. If indeed the technology are not immediately available, think about the potential transformation. So we need to have this view on how do we change and how do we adapt in the later stage.
Thank you.
Elsa, can I jump in on that question very quickly? Because it's a very key aspect that we're trying to tackle in our program, right? Because as I said, so our program we have a goal of raising 500 million in concessional finance, right? We don't have that yet, but we're spending this year working on raising that. Even with that amount, it's a relatively small amount of capital. And so for us, I think it really is, it's a very interesting and challenging question. Would we be better served trying to make interventions in these sort of efficiency efforts and achieve a 20%, 30% reduction of emissions at a facility, or waiting until sort of the breakthrough technology investment makes sense, which is far more capital intensive. It requires a lot more of our resources, which are quite scarce. And so I think this is a really interesting conversation and an important one for how our program will move forward, because we hear questions about CCUS all the time, but there's sort of complications with financing and how our funds can be used. And so it really is a key question for us right now in trying to figure out how that balance and achieve that balance.
Yeah. Anyone else want to come in on that question? Tarek, please.
I would probably second Daniel's view on this. I mean, I think especially in countries where the industrial base is quite in terms of performance, let's say emission factors per ton of cement. If we can do that reduction with a business case, with a viable business case, I think I would favor directing the money there through efficiency investment. It does really make sense. Because also on the breakthrough technologies, the playing field for the breakthrough technologies is not closed yet. We're kind of stuck around the CCUS and hydrogen, but we are seeing through rapid innovation in materials and conversions of technologies that might come alternative solutions down the road that are actually less capital intensive than CCUS, or for delivery of a lot of what's called high temperature heat. We are seeing few. So I would not dismiss. I think I would prioritize efficiency investments in the next 10 years.
Yeah, would also be good to look for the co-development for this new things then. I will give the word to Jürgen Wied. If you could please put on the camera and you can pose your question.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear and see me?
Yes, fine.
Good. I'm working for the Danish Energy Agency together with the Vietnamese Ministry of Energy on industrial energy efficiency, and we've been working in that field for quite a few years. My perspective here is that sometimes when we talk about financing, we leave out a very important component here. We talk about financing packages and so on. But if we stay with easy to abate technologies, when we visit industries, we see very, very big potentials for improving energy efficiency, even with very, very low payback periods. It's quite appalling to see how reality is. And then when we go to the banks and say, why don't you fund investment in energy efficiency projects? They say there are no projects. We don't receive any. So I think we have a real issue here. Why don't such cost-effective projects that the companies cannot afford to invest in themselves, why don't they reach the banks? So this is what we work on by doing a lot of capacity building and on the ground, and we focus. We made a project a few years ago. I'm not going to any detail, but we work with the banks to set frameworks for very specific sector-specific technologies. What should a project look like for you to invest in that project? And we made a lot of projects within a few sectors. We managed to bridge that gap. So I think we need to work a lot more on filling that particular gap. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Any reflections from the panel? Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just very quickly say, I think that part of the challenge is the disconnect between what you see in facilities and then how that translates up to sort of the levels where some of us work, right? I mean, I'll say from our perspective at CIF, we were, as I said, we work with governments and MDBs, and they go around and sort of identify where they think that they have the best opportunities. But some of these very easy solutions are not sort of the attention-grabbing solutions that make their way to decision makers, right? And so that is kind of a challenge that we do how to face. I find that in these conversations, every time I talk about it, someone's asking about CCUS every time. Yeah. But, you know, as Tariq said, there's lots of opportunities where we can come in and sort of do smaller scale things that can be as impactful. But the focus on the new technology really does seem to grab people's attention. And so it's kind of putting in the work to direct our attention in other ways as well.
Thank you. So I would like also to invite Penny Herbst to please put her camera on and pose a question.
Hi, can you? Hi, yes, thank you very much. I think this is a really appropriate conversation to have. And I was specifically, I want to make some comments and try and keep them brief, but then also say that, Tariq, I'm very glad that you raised this issue of export versus the import, because I think in developing countries, specifically, you know, in this part of where I am, sub-Saharan Africa, there's almost a race to be the first to be able to provide some hydrogen projects to de-risk not our own emissions, but to de-risk European emissions, right? And I think that that's placing a lot of confusion, and also, as far as that's concerned, the question then arises: well, who takes the risk? Because what we've seen in this rush is that, yeah, countries are very eager to take on potentially hydrogen, but with an expectation that someone else is going to take the risk. And we've seen Germany issue an RFP saying, well, we're going to put this out to the whole world and we'll see who comes in with the lowest cost, and we don't want to take any risk, right? So that's, I think that for me is very confusing. What I also wanted to say is that, and Daniel, we know each other, right? Daniel Morris. I'm an observer to the CEF, and I've also worked with the Green Climate Fund and with AFDB, and I see Wally Shonibari is on here as well, so I'd like to hear his input. I'm a bit concerned that in some instances we're using the multilateral development banks as the implementing entities, because those institutions have already got their kind of, in inverted commas, tried and tested policies and procedures. And those policies and procedures don't really anticipate taking on any risk. So for me, the solution would be, and this is for Daniel and potentially others, is when one's having a look at your funding model, is to find some partners that are willing to take risk, that are willing to put their capital at risk as part of a fund. And very specifically then carve out some of those MDB policies and procedures that are hampering some of the progress for developing countries as far as risk is concerned. I'd like to hear your opinions, the panel's opinions on this, and maybe also, Wally, if you are still with the AFDB, I think you know where I'm coming from. It would be good to hear your input. Thanks.
So thank you so much. And we can have just some quick responses for the panel as we're going forward in the agenda. So anybody who would like
maybe I can jump quickly on the issue of export markets. And I sometimes really also puzzled by the fact that countries are going for green hydrogen for export, where in fact, I mean, if you're looking at the export market, why don't you actually create an offtake agreement for green steel instead, rather than a green ammonia, because or green hydrogen, because the transport of hydrogen and efficiency losses along the way is enormous. So if you couple, if there's an interest in sharing the risk, particularly by lead markets in Europe or the US, why not look at the sharing the risk at the end product side rather than at the input side, the material input? So I would see a better business case if you say I would work with a steel manufacturer in South Africa and work with them and build the capacity around net or green steel and make the contract there, rather than I would do with an investment in green hydrogen, because it's also creating another type of discussions on those countries where you're diverting resources from electricity production for sort of access to electricity, particularly the case in Namibia, where you have 30% of the population without access to electricity, and you bring this enormous capacity to produce electricity for hydrogen for export. It is a contentious issue there to deal with. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And I'm really sorry, but I have to close this session now, and there will be some time later in the event as well to raise your voice. But now I will leave the word to Joseph, please. Thank you so much to all the panel members and the questions asked as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Åsa, and thank you to all panelists and audience for this discussion during this first session. So before moving to the second session, we'll propose a couple of polls that you will see appearing now on your screen. So we'll have a couple of questions with a few minutes to answer each of them. So in the first poll that will appear in a few seconds, we ask you to choose 3 options among 10, corresponding to what you consider being the most commonly used economic and financial instruments that are used for industry decarbonization in emerging economies. So we will leave you a couple of minutes to answer to those and to select 3 options only, please, before moving to the next poll. So we'll leave 30 additional seconds to analyze the answer to that first question. So thanks a lot. I will comment the answers to those polls after the second question. So we will now end this first poll and move to the second one. So the second one actually covers similar instruments, but the question here is more, which one do you expect to further developed over the next 3-5 years, and which ones do you believe would be the most useful in the future? So we will end the poll in a few seconds, and before opening to session two, maybe commenting very quickly the results. So on the existing instruments, the most chosen options were subsidies, concessional loans, as well as guaranteed income enhancement. So I believe this reflects really well the challenges highlighted in the scene setting and in session one, that currently finding a good business case for industry decarbonization is difficult and therefore requires specific instruments and some concessionality in order to achieve viable business cases. For the second poll, it is interesting to see that the instruments that were selected by the audience were carbon pricing, green premiums, and sustainability-linked instruments. So these are mostly market-based instruments, showing that the expectation or the wish from the audience is as well to see a market for green products emerge, to see a level playing fields being created through carbon pricing, and to see as well the possibility to have financing through the capital markets and sustainability-linked instruments. So thanks a lot to everyone for voting, and we will now move to session two, where I'm very happy to welcome 5 speakers. So I'd be grateful if each speaker can provide 5 to 7 introductory remarks, so that we still have some time at the end of the webinar for some Q&A with the audience. So we'll have today presentations from Manish Shurathia from Tata Cleantech, Manuela Fulga from the World Economic Forum, Gianpiero Nacci from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, Ivan Pavlovic from Natixis, and Wale Shonibare from the African Development Bank. So without further ado, I invite Manish to unmute and to present and to share his remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me to this August gathering. It's a great honor. I'm a managing director of Tata Cleantech Capital Limited. This is an Indian non-banking finance company, and it is dedicated to climate finance. We are promoted by Tata Group, which holds 80% stake, and IFC Washington, which holds 20% stake. Over the last 10 years, we have funded over 350 projects in India in the cleantech space, So we have a good experience about the way this sector is developing in India. And I would just share my experience about that. I don't have a presentation, but I'll be speaking verbatim. So I think the first question here is, which financial instruments are currently used to invest in decarbonization projects? In India, what is happening is that most of the investments have happened in the renewable energy and to some extent in the energy efficiency space, especially electric vehicles. Now, under renewable energy, most of the investments have happened in the wind sector and in the solar sector, and to some extent in the small hydro. In India, what is happening is that these investments are happening in two stages. One, when the projects are greenfield, and the second stage when the projects are operational. When the projects are greenfield, then most of the investments are being done by the specialized institutions like us or by banks or by other non-banking finance companies. So this is the stage when the projects are under implementation and the project and the debt instrument carries more risk. So this at this stage, essentially banks and non-banking finance companies are funding this on the debt side. On the equity side, we have seen that a lot of foreign money has come into India because the 100% foreign direct investments is allowed in the renewable energy sector. If I see the last 8 years, then about 70 billion has been invested in India in the renewable energy space, out of which 20 billion has come in the form of equity and 50 billion in the form of debt. Out of this 20 billion, about 2/3 has come from the foreign investors like sovereign wealth funds or global utilities or the private equities. And the balance 1/3 has come from the Indian promoters. And a lot of these promoters are actually first generation promoters. Now we have also seen certain other established groups are entering this sector. As far as debt is concerned, as I told you, that funding is happening in two stages. In the first stage, the funding is happening through the non-banking finance companies and through the banks. This is when the projects are under implementation. Once the project gets implemented, then we are finding that the rating of the companies improve. At that time, there is a lot of interest from the other participants in the capital market, especially the infrastructure debt fund, the InvITs, and also to some extent the domestic bond market. We have seen that for the bigger companies in this sector, the companies which have now created capacity of over 1 gigawatt, the largest company in India has a capacity of around 8 to 9 gigawatts. And I would say the top 10 have capacities of more than 1 gigawatt. So these companies have also approached the international green bond market. And till date, about 18 billion has been mobilized through the international green bond market in India. In fact, even the Indian government has approached the international market and they have a plan to raise $2 billion for the clean tech projects, which will be implemented by the government companies, and out of which 1 billion has already been raised. So this is about the way the financial instruments are being used. So they are pretty much conventional financial instruments. But when it comes to the international market, the green bond issuances has happened. I talked about the investment of $70 billion, out of which 18 billion has been through the international green bonds. Lately, we have seen that sustainability-linked bonds have also become an important instrument, though these are still early days. In one of the earlier presentations, we saw that JSW has come out with the sustainability-linked bonds. In fact, in the financial sector, we were the first one to come out with a sustainability-linked bond from IFC. So even that instrument is catching up. Now, the other question is that what are the characteristics of these instruments and what are the underlying factors to make them effective? What we have seen is that these instruments essentially are long-term instruments. So when we give project loans, these are the loans which have an average maturity of 10 years and beyond. And this is considering the fact that most of the projects we see have power purchase agreements, which are for 25 years. And these projects are only viable if the power purchase agreements are for this long tenors. In keeping with this, naturally, the funding which is required is also long-term. And we have seen in India that banks and financial institutions are willing to give long-term loans, upwards of average maturity of 10 years and final maturity of 15 to 18 years. But when these instruments are getting refinanced through the domestic bond market or through international bond markets, most of the funding is happening with a 5-year tenure. So clearly, there's an assumption that these will get refinanced because, as I told you, after 2 years, the second round of financing happens. And when the second round of financing happens, ironically, it is for a shorter tenure of 4 to 5 years because they are from bond market. Now, the main reason is that these instruments, if they are raised from the international green bond market, are in foreign currency. But most of the revenues which are getting generated from these projects are in local currency. So naturally, there is a need for hedging the foreign currency into the local currency. And the hedging market in India is very shallow. So while sometimes in foreign currency, the developers are able to raise money at very competitive rates, as low as 2 to 3%. But after they hedge into local currency, then the cost of funding becomes very high, upwards of 10%. So I think this is one issue which needs to be tackled at a larger scale. So this is on the debt side. And the one key issue which we are facing is that while the contracts are long-term, and these long-term contracts are for 25 years, but then there is a huge refinancing risk because even when the projects are getting funded at the initial stage, they are getting funded through a floating rate loans. And naturally, if the interest rates go up, then some of these projects may not remain viable. That is one issue. When they are getting refinanced at a fixed rate. But the challenge is that they are getting refinanced for only 5 years, while actually they need to be again refinanced for the complete repayments. And that is when again they will be exposed to the refinance risk. So while the sector has developed, but a lot needs to be done. What is required in the sector is long-term loans which are at fixed rate, because the power purchase agreements which are signed are also the fixed power purchase contracts, where the cost of power is going to remain fixed. They are not linked to dollar or exchange rates. So this is the issue which I see. The other issue which we see in the market is basically the fact that the counterparties who are buying power, they are mostly government institutions. They are public institutions whose financial health is not very good. So we have discoms in India who are making losses, and they are the one who are buying power. So there's a concern that whether they'll be able to pay this power for a long period of time if they continue to make losses. So to take care of this problem, what the government has done is that they have come out with a public sector company controlled by the central government, which actually buys the power, and then it sells the power to the discoms, the distribution companies. And naturally, when the central government entity buys it, then it has the comfort of the central government, indirect comfort. And secondly, this entity has a tripartite agreement with the discom and also with our central bank. So if the discom delays the payment, then the central government agency who is buying power has a right to go to the central bank and deduct money from the account which these discoms have with the central bank. So that is the way comfort has been created. And after this was done, then we have seen that a lot of investments have happened into renewables. India has got a huge ambition. Today, while in the last 8 years, 70 billion has been invested. But the aspiration of the country is to go from the current capacity of 110 gigawatts to 500 gigawatts by 2030, which is enhancing the capacity by 4 times in the next 7 years. So clearly, a lot of investments will be required. And investment will be required not just in the energy production, it will also be required in energy storage. Because till now, renewable energy is directly being supplied to the grid. And the total capacity of renewable energy vis-a-vis the total power capacity is about 25%. As this ratio increases, the grid may become unstable. So we will need a lot of investment in the storage of power through batteries and through green hydrogen. So that investment is also likely to happen in the near future. So clearly, a lot needs to be done. And hopefully, we think that more financial instruments will emerge. And those financial instruments will emerge, which are more long-term and which are fixed rate. In this respect, the pension funds and insurance funds and the mutual funds will have a very important role to play. And today, these funds are not very active in the clean tech market because of the fact that by statute, big insurance companies and pension funds, they can invest only in those assets which are rated AA and above. But most of the clean tech projects, because they are supplying power to those institutions who are not very strong in terms of financial health, that's why they don't get a rating of more than AA. They get a rating of best A+ to at best AA. So because of that, good part of the capital market is not able to invest. So there again, we think that there is some room for innovation in terms of first loss guarantees, which probably can be provided by multilateral institutions or by the government institutions, so that the credit quality improves through the first loss guarantee, and then a bigger capital market becomes open, including the pension funds and the insurance companies. The other issue I would like to address is, what are the small scale instruments which are being used and how they're being scaled up. So in this respect, what has happened is that our central bank, they have come out with a scheme of green deposits. So now Indian banks can raise green deposits, small deposits from retail investors. And this in turn can be invested for the smaller projects in, say, solar rooftop space, or say greening the supply chain through electric vehicles, or for energy efficiency. So while this scheme is there, but what needs to be done is that we need to have better taxonomy so that the market is clear about what is green. A lot of work has been done in EU in this regard, and hopefully same thing will happen in India as well. India is also working on the carbon trading scheme, and already the government committee has been appointed, and we are hoping that this the recommendation of the committee will come and this market will become operational in India. Finally, what needs to be done, which I already answered.
Manish, if you could wrap up in the next minute or so to leave Manuela make her presentation, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, surely I'll do that. So in summary, what needs to be done is that we need to strengthen our public financial institutions so that more funds come into this and the cost of fund comes down because the perceived risk will come down. That is number one. Number two is, as I told you, we need to have a standard taxonomy. And number three, which is very important, is that today the manufacturing ecosystem is still developing in India. A lot of our imports are from other countries dominated by China. And if we really have to scale up sectors like solar and green hydrogen, then we need a manufacturing ecosystem. So something needs to be done to encourage that. So this is in summary about what is happening in India. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Manish. Very insightful speech showing not only the instruments that can be developed and are developing right now, such as green bonds, but also potential new sources of finance and how they can help overcome the challenges in India. So I now invite Manuela Fuga, who's lead of sustainable finance in the World Economic Forum, to make her presentation.
Thanks a lot, Joseph, and perhaps while I give the first kind of 2 seconds remarks, fantastic, we can get the slides on. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everybody on the line. And as Joseph was saying, I lead the Transition Finance Initiative at the World Economic Forum, where we seek to identify solutions to really accelerate financing towards some of the innovative decarbonization technologies that the previous speakers of the previous panels have been mentioning. And we know that ambitious commitments have been made. We know that there are significant amounts of capital, both public and private institutions committed. Nevertheless, the IEA still estimates that a 4-fold increase in clean energy investment is needed for the world to remain on track against its Paris targets. We also know that particularly in the post-2030 area, the abatement will really rely on technologies that are currently early stage and not mature. These technologies need to be tested, they need to be validated, and they need to achieve commercial scale deployment in the coming decades. And the reality is we're quite far behind. For example, from the aviation sector, the project pipeline of sustainable aviation fuels needs to increase by 5 to 6-fold by 2030 to realistically achieve the aviation 2050 targets. With that in mind, and that's a slide that you see popping up here, this issue is not really one of market inefficiency that could easily be addressed within the financial ecosystem, but is rather one of market failure, where the financial system is failing to deliver the investments required at the systemic level. We've heard in the opening remarks and in the previous panel of all the challenges. I just wanted to frame it in the terms that we're using within the initiative, which is really the way that academics refer to it, the value of debt. And that's the inability of businesses to secure financing for the initial commercial scale deployment of a new technology, mainly because no traditional finance provider is ready to take the lead, given the high capital intensity and the high levels of technology risks that these projects entail. So moving on to the next slide, the way that we have addressed this market failure, we started to address this market failure at the World Economic Forum is by convening public, private, and multi-stakeholder collaboration to really improve the bankability of these decarbonization technologies. We bring together financiers from across the entire investment value chain. You see bankers, insurers, asset owners, and asset managers, investors, but also a few public financiers, such as multilateral development banks, that we convene alongside industrial corporations from hard-to-abate sectors, steel, aviation, trucking, shipping, and others. And we also invite technology experts such as hydrogen or sustainable aviation fuel producers alongside governments and policymakers to co-design financing solutions together and identify the policy interventions that would be most effective to mobilize private capital, and of course answer to some of the challenges that were presented in the previous panel. So moving on to the next slide, and this is really the summary of the conversations that we've hosted within our community. The reality is the key to unlocking financing at scale, in our opinion at least, really lies in these three levers. One is identifying new ways to blend capital. And of course, I think each speaker touched upon this in various ways, but it is crucial to identify effective de-risking mechanisms for some of those hardest to finance projects. The second way is to identify new contracts and new ways of doing business, where industry participants and capital providers can work together in transformative business models. And finally, of course, is the enabling environment and targeted public intervention that can incentivize early movers, de-risking, and set a very clear policy signal to increase the confidence of investors towards net zero technologies. I'll deep dive in each of those subsequently. So moving on to the next slide. So on innovative blended finance mechanisms and ways to bring different sources of capital together. So we've reflected on these ways, and we published 4 financing blueprints, such as this one that you see on the slide. So the example that you have up here is the blueprint for hydrogen technology, H2DRI to be precise, applied to a steel production plant. And what we did is we worked with the private financiers, the public financiers, but also the corporates to identify what would be their type of, essentially what type of capital they could deploy concretely in such an archetypical project to determine the most ideal or best financing structure for this net zero opportunity. And what we hope is that this would be used as a source of inspiration and replication in the real economy. We were hoping to demonstrate that financing this type of project is possible, even though, as the slide entails, is really complex. To move on to the next slide and touching for a second on transformative business models. The World Economic Forum launched a few years ago a coalition of companies that uses their purchasing power commitments to create early markets for innovative clean technologies across 8 hard-to-abate sectors, the ones that you see on the slide. We're pretty proud to say that since the launch of FMC, the First Mover Coalition at COP26, it sent the largest demand signal in history. And we're now at 12 billion commitments from the private sector to purchase innovative clean technologies by 2030. An example of such a commitment from the financing world is Bank of America, where they committed to using SAF for at least 20% of their total annual corporate and commercial jet fuel usage. But they're also committed to catalyzing a mobilization of 2 billion sustainable finance capital sources for the production of SAF concretely through a partnership with Sky Energy and American Airlines. So these are new ways in which businesses, corporates, financiers are coming together and identify these transformative business models. We said establishing new contracts that ultimately improve the probability of commercial success. Finally, I'll touch upon the policy aspect of it. So the enabling environment and the regulatory framework, if we could go to the next slide. And many other speakers touched upon this, but the reality is investments will need some sort of confidence from policymakers in which technologies they would need to mobilize capital at scale. And while, of course, programs such as the REPowerEU, the InvestEU, the Inflation Reduction Act have been critical to move the needle on some of these technologies. The focus areas that you see on the slide are really the ones that we believe would be most important for governments to take into consideration for the next phase. Generating demand, developing reliable and scalable supply chains, and finally unlocking finance to establish other enablers. I'm happy, to take any questions, to deep dive on hydrogen specifically in the Q&A, but with that, I'll pass back to Joseph. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much, Manuela. So it's very nice and targeted presentation showing not only how new business models can emerge, notably by developing demand for low carbon products, but also on the finance side, showing the role that blended finance has played with interventions from both public and private actors. And I think the blueprint for the hydrogen-based plants that you close enable in a very concrete way to illustrate where does all these pieces come together to make viable projects. So I'd like now to invite Gian Pieronacci, who's Director of Sustainable Business and Infrastructure at the EBRD, to share a few words. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I have a problem with my camera. Give me just a moment.
Indeed, we cannot see you, but we can
yes.
see. Yeah,
I think you can see. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much, and for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here and speak to this very high-level audience. So my name is Gian Pieronacci. I'm a director in the Climate Strategy and Delivery group of the EBRD. My team has the responsibility to cover the business support and the policy work in a broad set of areas. We cover the corporate sector, we cover energy and infrastructure, and also we have the cross-cutting responsibility for climate resilience and nature finance. So I'll try to give you a bit the perspective of how to accelerate industrial decarbonization in the context of the region where we operate, which is very diverse, comprises primarily emerging economies and some developing countries. Next slide, please. So just to give you a few points on the context, despite a quite important progress in the last few years and decades, the region where we operate remains still highly carbon and energy intensive, and also I would say material intensive. So this has, of course, profound implications, in terms of competitiveness of these economies, but also of corporates. It's also entails constraints in the way resources can be prioritized and that are available. So there are restrictions in terms of capital available for modernization, but also higher resource intensity, higher carbon intensity means higher risk, higher dependence on these resources, higher cost of capital, and typically also affected returns on the investments, which ultimately may deprioritize in the short term low carbon investment. Next slide, please. To maybe continue a bit on the context, this is an EBRD assessment, so don't take it, don't quote it. It's just more like to give an order of magnitude about what we see as the financing gap in our region when it comes to investments that address climate change. And again, it's just illustrative, but just to say that there is a huge gap, which basically, in my view, brings two implications. One is that this is not something that the public sector can address on its own, so the role of private capital becomes crucial and critical, but also that there is an issue of prioritization. So, and in this context, it's very important to identify and provide clear market signals, both on the policy, but also on the investment side, that can help the prioritization. Next slide. I want to make a point here, let's say, about the role of EBRD as a multilateral development bank, but also, trends in the financial sector. I would like just to draw your attention on 2 points. One is that, and this is quite typical, one is that there is a strong focus on climate and sustainable investments. Half of our business volume these days is linked to projects that deliver a climate outcome. But also, very importantly, from the beginning of this year, we introduce a filter in the way we identify investments. So all projects we finance have to be aligned with the objectives and the principle of the Paris Agreement, which represent an orientation principle in the way we use our capital, we consume our capital, and we support our clients. And again, this is just something important because it's, of course, an overarching trend in the financial sector. Next slide. So you can skip this one. So we save a bit of time. Next one, yeah. I think what is important here is to reflect that we can develop financial instruments. We can, of course, innovate, but at the same time, the overall investment environment is important. And I guess the role that we believe organizations like the EBRD and other entities can play is really create all these building blocks that gradually improve market conditions and facilitate investments. And here you have some example. It's about creating programs for project support to address project preparation. It's about blending instruments. The previous speakers talk about it. It's about very much supporting regulatory improvements and the way the policy landscape evolves and is more supportive of investments. So it's the famous enabling environment. But we believe that this is very important because it's the only way to address the risk and gradually reduce the cost of finance. Next slide, please. Actually, you can go to the next one, again, to save time. A couple of points here. What we believe is that it's not only about investments in low carbon projects. It's also about engaging with, and I'm talking primarily, not exclusively, about what we can do in the corporate sector, but this is also quite relevant for example, energy utilities. It's important not only to work on the decarbonization investment, but also in triggering the behavioral change. So, and that's why, for example, we have set up a program we call Climate Corporate Governance that support our clients in introducing climate and nature-related consideration in their decision-making process, in their management practices. It provides them support to set up transition plans. All of these help creating these changes, but also allow some of these companies to be able to understand better their risks and be able also to access the capital market and develop, for example, sustainability-linked financing instrument. Next slide. At the same time, to achieve systemic impact and systemic transformation is important also, as I said before, providing these market signals and these policy signals with increasing level of certainty. And that's why we've developed a series of sectoral, country level, municipal level investment platforms that basically low carbon pathways that basically try to achieve a number of objectives. On one side, provide analytical integrity and coherence in the definition of the scenarios of decarbonizations. Again, at various levels, national, subnational, and sectoral. In the second, they bring together, in the second sort of level, they bring together all the relevant stakeholders, is the public institutions, the project developers, but crucially, from the very beginning, the financial sector and the investors. And in this way, you identify, you give clear signals in terms of what type of technologies are needed for the decarbonization, but also what investments, what are the investment needs. And that, the theory behind is that this, provides more certainty to the market, reduce the transaction cost, and also the timing for investments to take place. Next slide, please. Yes, on the back of these considerations, we've developed a number of financing instruments that try to achieve both deep decarbonization, but also the behavioral change. So one example is a program that we have set up together with the Clean Technology Fund and the Green Climate Fund, which basically provide a concessional parallel loan to decarbonization projects which achieve a minimum let's say climate outcome, is about 10 to 15,000 tons of CO2 emission reduction per annum, depending on the region. And basically the way the parallel loan is structured, it starts at the same commercial terms that EBRD finance, and then there is a step down interest rate which is linked to specific milestone achieved. And typically we embed 2-3 milestones, 1 or 2 which are focused on the actual physical impact associated to the project or the expected physical impact, And then there is at least one milestone which is linked to the behavioral change, which can be, for example, the publication of the TCFD report or the approval of a transition plan at the company level. So in this way, we try to achieve both the physical impact, but also what I mentioned before, the behavioral change, which ultimately is the condition to make the low carbon transition irreversible. There are a few examples in the next few slides. For example, if you go to the next one, sorry, the following one, which is the program we have, the GCF, which cover a part of our region, and summarize here a bit the eligibility criteria. But I can provide more details during the Q&A. I would like also to address another point which was emerged during the polls just a few minutes ago, which is the fact that deep decarbonization projects tend to be, of course, highly capital intensive. So it's important to develop the solution that enhance the capital structure and remove, for example, the borrowing constraints that often is an element that, let's say, delays the investments decisions. So in this context, it's important to look at a variety of tools and instruments, including subordinated finance, green equity. And so this is where the role of guarantees becomes important, but also other instruments like green equity instruments. I would probably stop here. Maybe if you can go on the final two slides, just because I want to mention briefly about hydrogen. Yes. So we haven't talked about hydrogen too much right now, but just to say that this is clearly provides a solution for both creating the revenue streams in the developing, in the emerging and developing economies to support the decarbonization, to create industrial clusters, but also support the onshore of manufacturing capacity. This is an analysis of DBRD that shows the potential in a number of the sub-regions in our countries of operation. You can see that, for example, particularly when it comes to North Africa has the potential to produce green hydrogen at a very, very competitive price. And if you go to the next slide, and clearly what we expect in the short term, the main focus would be on the export market, but we expect in the next 15 years also the emergence of a domestic market where supply chains will be extended within the countries, and new industrial opportunities, low carbon industrial products can be relocated in these markets. I will stop it here, and very happy to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Gianpiero. It was great to hear as well example of products and programs developed by the EBRD. Also great to see the Paris alignment showing the role of portfolio allocation from finance institutions to support industry decarbonization and more probably climate goals. So I would like now Ivan Pavlovich, who's energy transition specialist at Natixis, to share his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, all of you, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share the perspective of a commercial bank willing to support the energy transition all across the globe. So as we have already touched upon the subject of financing green hydrogen, I think it's probably topical to share the conditions under which we have been part of the non-recourse debt financing deployed for the Helios NEOM project in Saudi Arabia. So please, next slide. And we think this is a very interesting hydrogen project to look at, and we've been very fortunate to support this project in a series of instances, being the technical advisor, being a mandated lead arranger, and finally being a green advisor for the project. So why is this project a landmark one for the global H2 sector? Well, for a set of 4 reasons. First, it's size. We're talking about an $8.5 billion project, so clearly the biggest announced to date. Second, because it has a truly international reach with a global logistic chain. as you might be aware of, this project is not only about producing green hydrogen in Saudi Arabia with desalination assets and renewable generation assets. It's also about converting green hydrogen into green ammonia for exports. And so basically, the value chain underlying the project is really wide, from upstream, so desalination and renewable assets, to shipping in the form of green ammonia to end markets. A third point I'm really happy to insist on is the type of funding provided, because not only is this project the biggest H2 project announced to date, but it's also a project that has been funded with over 70% of non-recourse debt. Of course, I will get back to this later. And finally, it's a landmark project because its status is a project that has reached construction phase. So now when looking at the conditions for onboarding a substantial share of non-recourse debt financing, well, we see, I would say, three factors that most of you are very familiar with, namely factors that, in our view, are critical in meeting or mitigating the sources of a project risk, being construction and technical risk. Obviously, one of the elements to keep in mind when it comes to the construction phase of the project is that the project entails developing 2.2 gigawatts of electrolysis capacity. And obviously, for the supplier of equipment, it entails a major upscaling effort in the production of electrolyzers. The second element is obviously in relation to the credit risk. So the adequacy of projects' cash flows and debt service, which is obviously one of the key elements banks would be looking for when considering deploying non-recourse debt financing. And finally, we have a counterparty risk in the form of all the players involved, the bodies involved, in particularly on the EPC side and on the offtake side. And quite interestingly, when we look at this project, we see a set of three cumulative supports that have enabled commercial banks like Natixis to deploy non-recourse debt financing. The first set of factors is really the strength of the sponsorship, with NEOM, with Aqua, and Air Products, being involved, in particular Air Products, in all stages of product development, and I will get back to this later. Another point, which is probably the more crucial at this stage of green hydrogen sector development, is a strong offtake contract. Here we're talking about a 30-year fixed price take-or-pay contract with Air Products. And obviously, one of the key elements here to mention is the credit worthiness of the Air Products, being an A-rated global chemicals company. It certainly helps, as I will further elaborate in a few seconds. And finally, what we have is a strong lump sum turnkey EPC, also with Air Products being the sole counterpart. So these three elements adding together, have enabled commercial banks to deploy non-recourse debt financing for a very large, first of its kind, green ammonia export project. And looking at the counterparty risk, you see clearly that the involvement of Air Products was really instrumental, in mitigating the various sources of risk for this project. And we can say that the project risk was eventually, with Air Products being so much involved in all steps of a sector of project development, being down to some extent to a counterparty risk. So clearly, this NEOM project is a landmark project when it comes to raising non-recourse debt financing, but clearly the involvement of such a creditworthy and involved sponsor will not necessarily necessarily be replicable in all instances. Okay, next slide, please. So I think that if we want to replicate the experience in developing countries, there are a few specific sources of risk that commercial banks have to tackle and have to tackle with the help of other counterparts or stakeholders, like for instance MDBs. So we think, for instance, of the lack of potential local know-how, but this is something that can be mitigated by just onboarding an international EPC company. I think also of the currency risk, which can be tackled by structuring an offtake contract, which is denominated into an international currency. But when it comes to the political risk, which obviously is one of the key sources of risk in developing countries, we see clearly the need for commercial banks being involved in these projects to build a sort of alignment of interest between various stakeholders. And here, the direct implication of the host government through a direct equity investment can be a way to align interest. And obviously, MDBs can be of help by providing a specific loan to the host government to fund its equity investment. The other point that is, I think, quite interesting, and I think this is something that is being explored in other hydrogen projects, particularly those in Africa, is to some extent the oversizing of infrastructure assets, like for instance desalination plants or renewable energy assets, to serve local purposes. And again, there is some room for involvement on the side of MDBs through specific infra development programs to accompany the oversizing of the infrastructure asset developed for the purpose of these green hydrogen projects. And just as a conclusion, if we, so next slide, please. So if we try to segregate the various sources of risk, I think that if we take industrial and energy assets as a whole and try to gauge to what extent they can be project financed or financed following a corporate approach, it is clear that the key element is the offtake contract. If the commercial risk and the associated price and volume risk can mitigate it through a long-term offtake contract, then obviously the project is eligible for project financing or for a project financing approach. On the contrary, obviously we have to resort to a corporate financing approach, and then obviously there are two options: either to have a credit-worthy local company that is solid enough from international commercial bank standards to be eligible for direct corporate financing, or the project will have to be financed through the local subsidiary of an international group. So lots of options potentially available, but the key element when deciding on the type of financing that can be deployed is clearly the extent to which the commercial risk can be mitigated. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anton. It's great to hear a bit more about the prerequisites or the conditions for commercial banks to engage in such projects, as well as understanding how the intervention can take place either on project finance or corporate finance. I would like now to welcome our last speaker for session 2, Wale Shonibare, Director of Energy Financial Policy and Regulations at the African Development Banks. And as we have limited time for the Q&A, I would also invite the audience to start raising their hands in case they would like to ask questions after Wale's intervention. Thank you.
Yes, hello everybody, and thank you for inviting me to this very interesting conversation. Being the last to speak means that most of what I was about to say has already been said, but what I'll try to do is just put things into the African context and also highlight work that the African Development Bank has been doing. We've said there's a significant amount of policy work that needs to be done, and the government also needs to provide the enabling environment and demand signals to allow many projects of this nature to happen. So if we go to the first slide, I'll try and go very quickly. African Development Bank, we cover the entire continent. All 54 African countries are member states and shareholders of the African Development Bank, but we also have non-regional member countries, mainly OECD. Next slide. So we're saying that, I mean, the energy deficit in Africa is widening quite significantly. The key problem we have is actually energy access. You know, over 600 million people without access to electricity. And obviously that gap is going to widen unless we do something about it. In terms of industries, only certain parts of the continent have high levels of industrialization. So we have to really focus on the energy access issue. Next slide. So if we look at what's been happening in terms of you know, financing of green energy solutions, and we've seen a lot of the activity has been in Northern Africa and also South Africa, and then the rest of the sub-Saharan Africa has been a bit limited, and the growth has kind of slowed down a little bit compared to what we saw around 2015 to 2018. But the main thing from this slide is just to highlight the fact that the amount of investment needs to increase by 8 times if we're to get to addressing our energy deficit. We're looking at something like $25 billion of investment per year that's going to be required compared with current levels. So there's a need to scale up quite significantly. Next slide. So the story is different in different parts of Africa, where you can see that in terms of the energy mix in North Africa, it's highly carbon intensive, about 93% fossil, and also in South Africa, which is largely coal dependent. In East Africa, the story is a little bit different because they have significant hydro and geothermal resources, and also Central Africa. So we have to adopt different approaches when we look at these countries, and those Northern and Southern Africa also have local industry and have significant export markets in Europe. So in the context of CBAM, these industries will also have to decarbonize. But even with electrolyzers, you need significant amounts of solar resources, and we find that several of our countries have the ideal conditions to be able to produce green hydrogen, green ammonia for export. And we have been trying to enable that process. Next slide, please. So we all know about the figures around emissions. Africa has contributed less than 3% of cumulative emissions. So the key thing for us is also that the emissions are actually more from land use change and forestry as opposed to energy. But energy is important, but it's also important to look at what's causing emissions. Since many of our countries are not as industrialized, you find that there's a need to address other sources of emissions as well, not just what's coming from the energy sector. Next slide. Yeah, so here we're saying that in the energy sector, there's a lot of growth that we're seeing in distributed generation, off-grid, mini-grids, and that's where a lot of those solutions will be clean energy. And there are instruments that we have devised to accelerate growth when it comes to decentralized energy generation. Next slide, please. So again, we can skip this slide. We're just saying that, you know, renewable energy introduces intermittency, and we have to look at the costs of balancing as well as stabilizing the grid, which is often not talked about when you try and compare the cost of renewables versus other forms of energy generation. Next slide. And here, the point is that Africa is attracting only 3% of climate finance. So there's a need to certainly try to attract more climate finance to the continent compared to the other parts of the world. And that's part of what the conversation should be about during COP and these gatherings to highlight the case for Africa to be able to attract more climate finance. Next slide, please. Yes, here in terms of what the bank has done, we've invested considerable amounts in the energy sector. 80% of our investments have been on the public sector side, 20% from the private sector. We have a variety of instruments, lending instruments, guarantees. We are talking about high interest rates and de-risking, and then also investing equity, also investing in intermediaries. A lot of the discussion this morning or this afternoon, we haven't focused so much on venture capital, which has a significant role to play, particularly when it comes to new technologies. So by creating vehicles that can take more risk up front, we've looked to address that. Special initiatives that we have, the Desert to Power program, Great Green Wall, Africa Energy Marketplace. These are policy dialogue programs that we have. And we also support African countries in developing their NDCs, and we have special climate funds to help them build capacity. Next slide. Here, we've just talked about our Sustainable Energy for Africa Trust Fund. You can read about that. We use it to provide technical assistance, concessionary financing, and also blended finance. Next slide. Yes, there are some other funds that we've helped create, the first renewable energy fund in Africa, and some of these are well-established fund managers who are now active on the continent. Next slide. Yes, we also have other funds, and interesting one, the Canada Africa Development Bank Climate Fund is a new one. Again, these are all there to support climate finance for the continent. I can't go into the detail now, but we can talk about it later. Next slide. Okay, the next few slides, we've just given some case studies of work we've done. So we have a leveraging energy access finance framework. Here we're trying to attract more local currency into financing, because many of these projects where you have lower socioeconomic groups, they cannot take the exchange rate risk, foreign exchange rate risk, so we try to facilitate more local currency. Next slide. And then Desert to Power program, we want to create a green zone across the Sahel. It actually involves 11 countries across the Sahel. We've developed various financing instruments to do that. These are fragile countries, and so it's difficult to attract investment. Next slide. Again, we have a significant mini-grid program, and we've used that to create, in some countries such as Nigeria, the largest mini-grid markets in the developing world, and that's working quite well, working with the World Bank on this one. Next slide. Yeah, and then again, in places like DRC, where the grid is quite limited, we've also been able to set up mini-grid programs. Next slide, I think that's the final one. Yes, okay, I've tried to go as fast as possible so that we'll have some time for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now we'll move to the Q&A. So we're conscious that the time is the end of the webinar, but we'll take an additional 5 minutes. So I will start with one that also comes from Penny Hurst in the chat regarding the cost of capital. So to understand first, if there are any mechanisms or instruments that are being implemented to lower the cost of capital that can be a major barrier in emerging and developing economies. And in the case of NEOM, Yvon, also how the cost of finance from the host country also influence the investment decision of the final project costs. Thank you.
Sorry, who was that? A question to me or?
Yeah, this is for all panelists on cost of instruments, the cost of capital, and then more specifically to Yvon regarding NEOM projects. So feel free to speak first.
Okay, so I mean, what I'd say is cost of capital is a reflection of risk to a certain extent. So although you can help provide credit enhancement, by having guarantees or strong off-takers, etc. But the macroeconomic environment has to be right. So in a country that is fragile, obviously cost of capital is quite high. And in other cases where the macroeconomic situation is unstable, where the government is borrowing significantly, they crowd out the private sector. So part of what we do is also engage in the policy dialogue so that those macroeconomic parameters will be in place in order to attract cheap capital. But we do have blending facilities. You can provide blended finance, and we can provide guarantees to a certain extent, credit enhancement. But those things are just a drop in the ocean. You need to have solid fundamentals to reduce the cost of capital. That's my contribution.
Yeah, I would agree with Wale. In India also we have structures based on partial risk guarantee, first loss guarantees, but then that can only be drop in the ocean when we are talking about investment of trillions of dollars. Eventually, what we need is a mechanism to reduce the risk in the project. And that risk is best reduced if the contracts are enforceable and if the off-takers are strong. I think those are two fundamental things which need to be done in structuring the projects. Once that is done, then the cost of capital automatically comes down. Thank you.
Joseph, regarding the NEOM project, could you repeat your question, please?
Yeah, it was to understand for the financing for the host country also influenced the cost of capital and therefore the willingness to invest in the project.
Okay, so clearly what we see with the NEOM project is the indirect involvement of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So as I said, when it comes to the overall strength of the project, having three strong project sponsors, with one being an emanation of a sovereign entity with a very strong credit profile, enhances the overall strength of the project. So that's a clear credit consideration for commercial banks.
Thanks a lot. Thanks again to all of you as well for joining the panel and joining the webinar. We are now closing the session 2, and I will hand over to my colleague Dea Sayen, who leads our industry program here at the Environment Directorate of the OECD. So for the next couple of minutes and closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Joseph, and also to Asa and to both of you for co-organizing as OECD and LeadIT this interesting event, and also our speakers who are still here with us for all their valuable interventions. My colleagues Johan and Dominique have also done all the logistics, so thanks to them as well at our side. Now, a few summary points from what you heard today. It's important to repeat, we know this, but the industry decarbonization requires a suite of technology options. So that makes it very different than all the other sectors we know. We heard a number of positive developments that at the country level, sector level, targets, roadmaps are being prepared, and especially in emerging and developing economies. Many new projects are being announced, including energy-intensive sectors like steel. So that is an important highlight. And we've also heard today a number of new financing instruments that are being developed as we've seen for low emission hydrogen projects. Now, all this is going to be covered in a new paper that we are working on to release in a few months on examples and case studies of financing industry decarbonization. So you will hear more about that. But we've also heard today that there's a huge investment and a financing gap that still needs to be closed. And a number of challenges that are reason to that is coming from policy side. There is a still lack of market signals for investors. So that needs to be created. On the standards definition side, lack of international definitions for green products, interoperability and harmonization between standards are lacking. So that's more the policy risks we are hearing, or the challenges. On the financing side, obviously everybody have mentioned the high capital requirements, high risk investments of new technologies, and especially this is apparent for early movers. So all these risks combined, the cost of capital of projects also increase, especially in emerging developing economies. And we need to understand how we can avoid that, how we can minimize that. At the very first intervention from Indonesia, there was an interesting number about the cost of abatement of all the sectors. So there was about $40, but it could go up to $200 for some sectors, and probably even more expensive if you look at the net zero industry. So it's not cheap. That's I think the key message. And when the stranded assets are considered, so costs beyond the just mitigation cost, if no action is taken, are also huge, or if the delayed action case would happen even more. So it's an expensive transition we talk about for industry. I think this is important to highlight for a sector which has high profit interest. Now, the solutions we've seen creating demand for financing, especially integration with ESG practices. This is important developments and transition finance, but also on the regulation side, sustainable finance taxonomies are all important. So alignment with those are key. We heard concessional finance for mobilizing private finance, ADB finance as important next steps. Obviously, we need to take over the first mover risk. So that's a key area which warrants attention, as well as rewarding early movers. Blended finance, examples are given on first loss guarantees. That looks important also for industry sector, especially newer technologies, and green bond, sustainability linked bond frameworks and markets, as well as the role of venture capital are key. And this is actually resonated our poll outcomes. Today, it's more a subsidy environment, maybe for low carbon technologies in the industry, but in the near future, market-based instruments like carbon pricing, that also address the industry value chain emissions will be critical. And it seems also, yet it wasn't so much mentioned, but the financial institutions also need to raise capacity for industry decarbonization financing. But it's not only the money that will be needed for decarbonization, it's also the enabling conditions, as was mentioned by many, and business models, which include strategic planning, investment plans, roadmaps, regulations, de-risking mechanisms, which eventually leads to a development of a pipeline of projects to mobilize private capital. So I hope I was able to cover everything. It was a very rich discussion. You'll be able to access all material, including the summary and all the recordings on the website of the OECD CEFIM. And I think it goes the same for LeadIT in a few weeks from today. And I wish everyone a good rest of their day afternoon. Thank you very much.